We are not being very diligent right now about that with AI. So this is another one of the themes of CES this year. It's very funny because I'm going through all of these demos last night, and there is a kitchen faucet that you can talk to, you know. And I was like, why would you need to do that? And they said, well, you can ask it to pour you a single cup of water. I was like, okay, actually, that's really useful because then you don't need the measuring cup anymore, right? Just, okay, single cup, and it knows how to measure it. That's great. But what if it doesn't know the difference between scalding water and cold water, right? What if it's a child? And so there's all of these ways of interacting with something that's voice activated that you now start to think about, well, what's the context for that? How do we know that even though it gets programmed to do certain things, that it's actually doing things that are okay or good or well? And that's what I'm saying is it's very easy to get into that zone very quickly when you start thinking about artificial intelligence sort of being in everything in the world.
This is No Excuses with John Taffer.
So I've been really looking forward to having Mark Pesce all week. I've been thinking about you, buddy. Because as CES comes into Las Vegas and all these new technologies come, and I read an article a couple weeks ago about artificial intelligence that just scared the hell out of me. And, we were saying before we turned the microphones on, the future's a little scary.
It can be a little scary, absolutely.
Well, Mark is one of the primary developers of virtual reality. Really started MIT guy, right? Learned high tech, went into the high tech space you knew you were going to.
Yes.
Worked with Apple for a number of years in product development.
Yep.
Worked with VR in product development.
Yep.
What other things have you worked on in product development?
So I guess a lot of what I had to do, particularly in my early days, was around building computer networks. So we think of the internet as the computer network. And back in the early days, there were actually several competing ones. Apple had one, and there were a whole bunch of others. And I was really interested in making computers talk to one another because I could see that was very much both the future, and I was also thinking in terms of my career that you probably would not be laid off because networks were going to grow. And they did. They went for 25 years before anyone in networking ever got laid off for doing anything. And so I spent the first part of my career figuring out great ways to be able to get computers connected. And then once we had the computers connected, started to think about, well, what are people going to do with them? And this is where virtual reality came in so that we can now build these worlds together that can share information with us, that can inform us, that can educate us, all of those things.
What excites me about talking to you today is you're sort of a futurist. And your podcast, The Next Billion Seconds, and what is the next billion seconds?
So that's a unit of time, and it's around 31 years. So it's a generation, and it's a really good way of being able to get people to think about the future. So most of us, I will be retired in about a billion seconds, or maybe not. My uncle's nearly a billion seconds older than me. He's still working. But if we have kids, the kids will be grown up and graduated. A half a billion seconds is how long it takes a kid to get from kindergarten through college.
Wow, so it's not an arbitrary number.
No.
It's a powerful number.
It's a powerful way of thinking about time to help people plan. Where do I want to be in a billion seconds? And I've really started to give that a lot of thought because I'm starting to think about this not so much as the next billion seconds, but what's your next billion seconds? And how can I help you? How can I give you the best advice so you can make the best decisions for yourself, your family, your career in that period of time? And that's very much what the podcast is about.
Wow, that's neat. So when you started in computers and networking, those were the early days of computer communicating with each other. Now, I have a dear friend who was one of the creators of Cisco.
Yes.
And his name is Zane Taylor, and he was one of the engineers who created the initial internet communication systems. Yeah. Did you ever envision that the computer would be so residential, so personal?
So I think I probably did because when I was young, so when I was sort of 14 or 15, that was when the very first, what we called the microcomputers, not personal computers, but the TRS-80, which was Radio Shack's computer, and the Apple II, and the Commodore. Those were
I had a Commodore.
So there, and we weren't alone, right? That's the thing. There were millions of people like us. So I think in that sense, the computer had always been personal for us. It was really a matter of then figuring out how to make it personal for everyone else. Now, that was sort of the first part of what I was doing when I was 14. But then when I was in my 20s, I started to understand with networking that there would be ways to be able to connect information together. And there was this idea that had been floating around for a while called hypertext, of being able to link information together. And people had sort of tried it, but it had never really worked well. And then this thing came along that I saw in 1993 called the World Wide Web. And the first time I saw it, admittedly, I wasn't very impressed with it. I was like, well, okay, it's nice, but there's not a lot here. And I blinked, and by the time I'd blinked, it had doubled in size. And I blinked again, and it doubled in size. And I remember this is in October of 1993. It's when I was working at Apple. And I went home, and I had a whole system, because you had to have a very special system to be able to use the web in the early days. And every night, I'd come home, and I would surf the web. And I'm not making this up. At the end of the week, I'd surf the entire web. Because the web was small enough.
You could search the entire
You
thing.
could surf every single website on the web. And this is something people couldn't even conceive of doing.
Now, there was no search engines then.
No.
So you're typing in your backslash, colon, backslash, whatever.
Yeah.
And so you had to know the address to get there.
Well, people kept a list. There was a list, and you could just go down the list. Bing, click on the link. Here's the next site. Click on the link. Here's the next site, and you could get to the end of the list. And I was able to sort of stay current as they added new sites until about January of 1994. Right, so literally 25 years ago from when we're recording this. And then the list just started growing so fast that there was no human way that you could keep track of it. And so that was when I was looking, I was like, this is the moment. I remember running around to all of my friends going, oh my God, you've got to see the web. This is going to be so amazing. And they're like, why? I'm like, watch.
So in the beginning, it was really information going back and forth, really data being fed from one system to another. When did somebody like yourself see the monetization of this? Because when was the first business website? When did it really start to become a commerce platform? Because it wasn't in the beginning.
Well, it kind of
Or was it?
Well, so here's the story. So as far as anyone knows, I was the first person to give a public demonstration of the web in San Francisco, which is the epicenter of the web. So this is, again, January 1994.
And you did that.
I did that. I brought my machine over, got it all wired up, took over the phone line in the apartment because remember we were all using modems back then, and I'm giving these demos and showing people the web, not by saying, oh, here's this web, take a look at it. They would walk up, they say, hey, Mark. I say, hey, what's something you're interested in? Oh, I'm interested in gardening. And then I'd go out and I'd find a gardening website. And I'd be like, oh, wow, you found all this great information. What is this? So you'd get them by getting what they're interested in.
Gotcha.
Not by showing them this fancy new technology, but here's what it means to you.
Not the feature of the hardware, but the benefit to the user.
The benefit. Why does it matter to me? I was doing this, and then someone else came up that I hadn't met. He said, I want you to type in, and he told me what to type into the address bar. And it was Hotwired, which was the very first website for Wired magazine, which was the very first commercial website in the world.
I did not know that. Wow, Hotwired magazine.
So he was working on this. It hadn't launched yet. He's just like, don't show anyone else. This is a little secret. But he was working on it behind the scenes. And in fact, I then got to test the site as it was being built. It had the first classifieds online, the first advertising online.
And there were no graphics like today. This was pretty much just words.
There were, I think, maybe a few images, but they were very simple images because it would take too long to download a complex photograph.
Back then, right?
Very, very simply done.
Yeah, I guess it would take an hour and a half to download a photograph back then, not like today. Wow, so that was the first commercial site. Then I guess it just exploded from that point.
Well, I think once people saw what they could do, everyone got a crazy idea. I mean, Amazon goes all the way back to 1995, but we forget that Amazon used to only be a bookstore. Right? I mean, you can still buy lots of books on Amazon, but we forget that used to be the only thing.
Period. That's it.
That's it. Just books. And then it exploded and became retailing for everything.
But I remember when Amazon became, and you've written a bunch of books as I have, I remember when Amazon got up to 30% of all book sales was a huge ordeal. Then that they could actually take the business away from retail.
Yes.
So you have seen this industry grow from really just metrics and data going back and forth to this unbelievable commerce vehicle that creates more revenue than anything in the world.
Yes, and I mean it's now what they call the FANG, which is what Facebook, Apple, Amazon, and Netflix and Google. You know, if you add all of that together, it's close to, well, depending on what the price of Apple is on any given day, it's like $5 trillion in value. So we're talking about something that is not just a major economic force, but is one of the largest economic forces that we've got.
Oh, yeah, and I was I was hosting Fox Business last week, and I had a bunch of people in, and one of my topics was, new business models, the My Pillows, the Bowen and Box sheets. All of these businesses, they don't have retail stores, they don't have corporate offices, they don't have distribution centers, they don't have any of that. All they do is they post their website and they create internet commerce for it. And it's an entirely different business model. It's incredibly exciting. So You're here for CES.
Yes.
And you got your press passes. I know you got to go in and get a sneak peek.
Yep.
And for those of you who don't know, CES is the Consumer Electronics Show, which is here in Las Vegas every year. And if you want to know what's going on in the future and all the new products in consumer electronics, this is the show you go to. You've been going to the show how many years?
Oh, my goodness. The first year I went was maybe 1992.
So you've been going to the show a long time.
Because we were working with Sega. Remember Sega,
Of course.
video game company, on their virtual reality system back in 92 and 93. I was one of the designers of that system for them. So, so we were here showing the product off very privately in a very quiet suite, but bringing the big buyers, so, Target, Walmart, Sears back then, Toys R Us, and we would show them.
So virtual reality started back in 93, right?
Virtual reality actually goes all the way back to 1968.
Wow, the first time.
The very first virtual reality system was shown publicly in December of 1968. Ivan Sutherland, one of the fathers of computing, invented it. And it was such a big, expensive, hard problem that most people didn't follow it up until the late 80s, early 90s, when computing became cheap enough that it didn't take $100 million to build a VR system. It only took $1 million.
Right. And now with phones, obviously, it becomes a lot easier because you have the displays. Everybody has their VR display,
Exactly.
in essence, with their phone. You know what was interesting to me is I'm a VR fan. And I have my goggles at home, and I'll play some VR games. And I love the tourist stuff, walk through Paris and all those kind of things. I'm surprised that it hasn't become bigger than it is.
Well, it's okay. There's a couple of things. You're actually asking a lot of a person to completely cut themselves off from the outside world and enjoy a virtual experience.
That's a very good point because I can do nothing else while I'm doing that.
And so, we think of our smartphones as being an attention suck. Well, VR is that much more of an attention suck. And you have to be super careful because people can't really get up and walk around much if they can't see around them. and so we're turning a corner between what we think of as virtual reality and what we're going to see augmented reality, which is going to be something that's going to be more like a pair of fancy sunglasses. And so you'll see the world, but you'll also see mixed in with it things that aren't there. So you might think of them as electronic.
So you'll add to your experience, but you won't take away from what's going on around you. Wow, that'll make it then much more applicable to any situation.
Exactly, and it's much harder to do because you have to be scanning the entire world to figure out that if I'm going to put something and it's going to stand on this table over here, I have to know where the table is and how high it is so that the computer can place it correctly. And so if you think about like the new phones that do face scanning, like the Apple phone, which scans your face, these are the pieces of technology that Apple and other companies will need to be able to do this well in a form factor that looks like a pair of spectacles. We're still somewhere around 3 to 5 years away from that.
Really?
Yeah.
Once that happens and you anticipate VR will explode then.
Yes, absolutely.
It'll just become part of normal life.
Well, I think it's good because people are so tired of staring down into their smartphones all the time. This is the thing that's going to free us from that, although what it's going to do is it's going to put all of that data all around us all the time, which is...
It's invasive then.
It's a different kind of problem.
Right. Now you can stick it in your pocket. Then you won't be able to.
Yeah, it's going to be stuck in your head.
Right. So you were talking, before we went on the air, you were talking about CES, and you blew me away when you said this, that CES has become like a car show.
It's okay, so what's happened is over the last 3 years, as cars have become more and more seen as technology rather than just automotive, just an engine on wheels, but now a computer on wheels, CES has become more and more important to the automobile industry, so much so that Mercedes-Benz is not going to be at the International Auto Show in Detroit next week, and I'm going there.
Wow.
They're only at the Consumer Electronics Show this week.
Wow. So they envision their vehicles as more electronic than anything else.
And the announcements that they want to make. And I went to an actual vehicle launch at CES yesterday. A Chinese company called Byton introduced their first car called the M-Byte, which is kind of, I guess it's a fastback and all-wheel drive. It looks beautiful. And the dashboard is a 3-foot wide display. So the dashboard is all display, which, sounds nice, but I'm looking at it and, all of the press photos, it's turned up to white. I'm like, in the dark, that's not going to work. Right. It's like you really want night mode on that. And you also have to wonder if the display gets super busy, it's going to distract you from keeping your eye on the road. So in some ways, we're seeing a lot of really interesting stuff come out of the new cars from the new car designers. And in some ways, I look at this going, I wonder if that's going to pass safety testing.
So as gas engines become less frequent, and look, companies like Volvo are stopping to produce gas engines now. Cars, we use the term electric cars, but they're really more electronic cars now.
Absolutely, absolutely. Because the powertrain could be a battery, it could be hydrogen. Toyota shut off its new hydrogen batteries today at the Consumer Electronics Show. So we have all these different power technologies that are lining up that all convert to electricity. Even petrol engines, gasoline engines are now generally driving a generator to run the car, right? Because you have
It's
these
more about
hybrids.
the power, right, than the revolutions of the engine.
Yeah.
It's fascinating. So when you think about where cars are going in the future, it's interesting you mentioned Mercedes-Benz, because I read an article by the CEO of Mercedes about 8-10 months ago about how he envisions the world is going to be different in 15 years because of electronic and autonomous cars. So he was saying that, A, people are going to start moving from the central population areas, because when you drive in an autonomous car, you'll work, you'll do all that in the car, so commute time won't mean as much. So he feels people are going to start moving farther from the city. He talked about the fact that people are not going to own cars anymore. You're going to pick up your phone, hit a button, electric vehicle pulls up in front of your house, you get in it, you do your work, you do your calls, you eat dinner in the car, whatever it is you do. So that isn't downtime anymore. It's completely productive time. And then he talked about the whole demise of the mechanics industry, that these are vehicles that won't break very often. You know, the idea of the greasy wrench really doesn't exist anymore at that point. And his vision of an entirely different world just because of the electric vehicle was amazing to me. You live as a futurist. Do you see the same thing?
So we're working on a new podcast series called The Next Billion Cars, because we make 2 cars a second right now. So at 2 cars a second, that's the 15 years that this fellow's talking about. It's 15 years for us to manufacture, and everyone knows that that car, a billion cars from now, is really different than the car we have today. Here's the problem, is that actually the car companies don't understand what that car looks like yet. And car buyers, I was talking to a fellow, he needs a new car, his car is getting old, he likes it, but he knows it's time to get a new car, but he doesn't want to buy it because he also knows that the car is a moving target right now. And if he buys something now, you know, maybe in 5 years, it's actually going to be so much different and better.
2 years maybe.
Well, this is the thing, and you could see him going through this, and I'm watching him going, that's happening to a lot of people right now because we're in this transition point. And the other thing that the CEO of Mercedes-Benz didn't want to mention is if we're no longer owning cars, but we're renting them, then we actually need a lot fewer cars.
Right.
And I don't think any of the automakers are looking at how changes in ownership, changes in use are really going to affect the way we build an industry around cars. And this is them, in some sense, whistling past the graveyard. They all want to make sure that there's a place for them in the future, but we haven't actually figured out a path that gets to a future with them in it.
A little scary.
When you consider how important automobiles were to the economy in the 1960s and 70s, they're less important today, but still globally enormously important. And not just cars, but all of the supply chains that come into them. You know, so if we change that, and we clearly are, because there's CES is proof that we're changing it. If we're changing that, all of this other stuff is going to have to change around it. So he's absolutely right about that. But the question, I guess, is at the end of those 15 years, does he still have a job? And we don't know that.
That's what's and are there car manufacturers like this? And are all these different models available?
Yeah.
And I agree. And it's fascinating to see that kind of change.
And will people feel comfortable using a rental car even if they want a personal space? You know, if you're going to be taking that every day into the office, are you going to want to just summon a new car every day? Or are you actually going to want to have the same car that's got some specific features that you wanted and maybe the right cup holder and who knows whatever else?
Yep. So maybe it becomes a menu of vehicles that you choose from. And it's a personalized type of a situation. But that's been a large part of cars to date, is the personalization. You buy a car that is an extension of your personality, and I buy one with an extension of mine. I wonder if that personality disappears. As electronics and computers make us all see the same things and hear the same things and then buy the same things, do we all start to lose our individuality?
So we do know that the younger kids today actually don't care about owning cars. It is not a goal for them, all right? They often don't get licenses. They don't. So in some ways, the idea of car ownership, because they've grown up in an era of an Uber or car share or whatever it is, that they don't see driving as the pathway to freedom. They may see money as a pathway to freedom because then they get the Uber, all of that. But a car doesn't mean freedom to them in the same way it would have for you and I, because there was just no other alternative. So we've got to factor that in. In terms of whether technology is making us all the same, we can make two really interesting statements about this. Facebook, and I did a lot of research on this last year before all of the news about Cambridge Analytica and Facebook came out. Facebook has built an engine that's really good at watching you using Facebook, building a model out of that, and then feeding you more stuff that's going to get you to watch Facebook more, because that's what Facebook wants. And it had this weird phenomenon of both making you more like other people who were like you, but also making you more different in some ways than other people. So it ended up fragmenting people more and driving them almost into little tribes or camps. And so you do tend to be more like the people in the camp that you're in, and then less like the people who are in the other camp. And so that's definitely been happening with technology.
You know what else I find, and I'm going to go off track with you a little bit, is one who hires a lot of people. You know, I look at the impact of computers on gratification for young people. You know, when you and I were growing up, accomplishment didn't happen instantly. We had to work at it, right? The pat of the back didn't happen instantly. You know, today you can post a picture of yourself in your worst outfit, looking the worst you've ever looked, and somebody's going to say, "You look great today." And you get this instant gratification every time we post something.
This is why I didn't post any photos of myself today, but you're right.
So what I find is happening is people are leaving jobs quicker that are younger. Things aren't happening quick enough. That instant gratification isn't happening enough. I'm seeing that as a consequence of this electronic universe of instant gratification that we live in.
There's definitely two trends there. I mean, I do think that we have become a bit more wired to gratification because there are systems that are capable of capturing us around that gratification. So I completely agree with you. The other side of it is that, particularly in the younger generations, they're much more attuned to being aware of opportunities, and they will change their path to find the opportunity a lot more flexibly than we did, because we were very much like, and even in my career in technology, I saw this happening where I would basically work sort of between 2 to 3 years at a job and then move on to the next job. And that's technology that was sort of average, but that's now come down to, 18 months or something like this. So you keep on moving up the chain, particularly in your younger years. But if you're working freelance, then you actually have a series of gigs that might be 3 months or 4 months. And you're constantly looking for the next gig, and that's a very common mode.
And then you accelerate quicker, though. Your experiences are broader and faster for sure.
Yeah.
So I get scared when I read these articles on artificial intelligence. And there's a lot of people who, are raising red flags and talk to me about this. Do you worry about artificial intelligence? You understand it, of course, more than I do, and its limitations and where it goes. Is this something to be scared about?
So, thing I do want to tell listeners, on the very first episode of Series 3 of The Next Billion Seconds, we have a man named Werner Vinge, who's a very famous writer, but also coined the idea of the singularity, which is something that gets touted around as a very scary concept. And I think people should go and listen to him because he's very reasonable and rational, and he is not scary about this. He's like, look, there's different ways that we're learning to use computers to make us smarter, and here's some ways it can go. So I think at that level, there's less to worry about. But there's another level in which, not so much that we should be worrying about, that we should be focusing our attention. So we're teaching computers how to have autonomy, do things on their own. We're also teaching them how to have agency, which is to make up decisions about the things that they want to do. The thing that we haven't worked out yet is something called assurance. How do we know that the computer is doing the things it's really supposed to be doing, that we designed it to do, and it's doing them well? Let me give you an example from history. So when we started building things out of steel, like bridges and whatnot, we actually weren't very good at it. And there's this very famous example in Britain of the Tay River Bridge in Scotland that fell over in 1842 with a train on it, killed a couple hundred people, because we actually had no engineering practice about building things out of steel. And you think about that now in 2019, we know exactly how to build out of steel because we built a whole branch of engineering around it. That's what AI doesn't have, and that's why it's scaring us. So I'm working with people in Australia, in America, who are starting to build those core disciplines so that we can give these machines autonomy, we can give them agency. But how do we have some assurance? How do we have testability that they're going to act the way that we think they should act? And in the way that's good.
Rules, in essence. rules of conduct, in essence.
It's rules, but then it's also, I guess, supposed to finding out whether those rules are obeyed in practice. Because programming is rules, but you can write a computer program. That doesn't mean a computer's going to do it, because there's bugs and all sorts of crazy things.
Right. So it's fascinating. So then you're of the belief then as AI develops and we get more used to engineering it like we did steel, that it doesn't concern you long term.
Well, we are not being very diligent right now about that with AI. So this is another one of the themes of CES this year. It's very funny because I'm going through all of these demos last night, and there is a kitchen faucet that you can talk to, And I was like, why would you need to do that? And they said, well, you can ask it to pour you a single cup of water. I was like, okay, actually, that's really useful, because then you don't need the measuring cup anymore, right? Just, okay, single cup, and it knows how to measure it. That's great. But what if it doesn't know the difference between scalding water and cold water, right? What if it's a child? And so there's all of these ways of interacting with something that's voice activated that you now start to think about, well, what's the context for that? How do we know that even though it gets programmed to do certain things, that it's actually doing things that are okay or good or well? And that's what I'm saying is it's very easy to get into that zone very quickly when you start thinking about artificial intelligence sort of being in everything in the world.
Wow. So I've never even considered it in that way. So you can design a program, but the fact of the matter is it can behave in a different way. So once you design it and you test it and you know it's behaving properly, can you count on that behavior ongoing?
Okay, so let me throw another spanner in the works. If it's a fixed program, then probably it's going to do the same thing day in and day out.
Like a mathematical program, per se.
If it's a learning program and artificial intelligence is designed to learn, then that means that its behavior should change over time in response to everything that's going on around it. And this, again, is where we need to have some sense of assurance. So we want to know that even as it learns, even as it grows.
So we need to know it grows up to be a good guy, not a bad guy.
And this is why I think really one of the big areas in AI over the next 20 years is going to be how do we parent? How do we be good parents to these systems so that they grow up with good behaviors and good rules and make mistakes in good ways rather than bad ways? And we'll never get that perfectly right, but we should be trying to get it mostly right.
But you feel we can control it?
I feel it's going to be a partnership. All right. And I think that that's the way we need to think of it, because if we think of it as a controlling thing, we'll probably drive ourselves crazy, because these systems will be learning all of the time and they'll be constantly throwing up things that are unexpected. And we're going to have to get comfortable with that unexpectedness.
What happens when it knows more than we do?
Well, I mean, I think you could make a really good argument that there are certain systems that kind of do that in some, well, no. Google Maps knows way more about traffic than you or I do right now, okay? And so there are certain examples of systems that you can point at that already know way more than a human being, and we don't worry about that because we find them useful. It's what you're pointing at is what we call artificial general intelligence, which is an intelligence that's like a human but simply knows so much more. So when I was talking to Werner Vinci on my show, he put it like this. He said, Mark, look, you can always have a conversation with a goldfish. You're going to be doing it in goldfish language because that's what the goldfish understands. And yes, you're only going to be using a small part of your brain to talk goldfish, but you'll talk goldfish. When these things come along, they'll be able to talk to us. They'll be talking to us in human language, but it will be a very small conversation from a much broader conversation that they're capable of having. So if we get things that are that much smarter than us, and it's hard to know when that's going to happen. As a futurist, I don't like to put any bets on that because it's going to be hard for us to be able to tell what that's going to be like. And so it's just that's just a hard question. But either way, the conversation they're having with us is going to be similar to a human having a conversation with a goldfish, where we're only going to be getting a tiny little bit of that conversation.
So they have to talk to us in simplistic terms that we can understand because it's far more advanced than we are.
And you can take a look now. So they have a new chess playing AlphaZero, which is a Google chess playing program, and it just beat the pants off of Deep Blue, which was the former IBM champion. And Garry Kasparov, who's the human being who was beat by Deep Blue like 15 years ago, watched the game. And he thought he could see AlphaZero toying with Deep Blue. Now, the question is, was he just projecting that onto the game? This is the best human chess player in the world. Yeah. Is he projecting? Who knows? Maybe not. Maybe what he's seeing is, with his little goldfish brain, something that is so much better at chess than he is.
Right. The capacity is surpasses him by far.
Yeah.
Wow.
But this, again, it's a very narrow thing. A chess-playing computer is really interesting, but it's a very narrow domain of intelligence.
So I have been, I'm a very techie guy. If it plugs into a wall or works on a battery, I got to have one. So I'm now in a process of automating my home,
Yep.
Electrifying everything in my home. I am terrified of Alexa, Google Assistant. I mean, I'm terrified by these things, and I see you're shaking your head pretty vigorously. Should I be?
Well, this is a really interesting question because I don't have any Alexa devices in my house either. I do have Siri, and I guess I've made my peace with being able to talk to my phone, right? But I don't have any Google Assistant devices in the house. I don't have any Alexa devices in the house. And I agree with you that I share a certain amount of unease. You know what I think that unease mostly comes from is that you really don't know where that conversation is ending up. Like, Apple is super clear that when you talk to Siri, the conversation basically just stays in the device.
Yep.
And I feel okay with that level of it. But with Alexa and with Google, it's just going out there. It's building a profile. I know that there's a page you can go to inside your Google profile that tells you everything you've ever said to the Google Assistant. You can see it line by line by line.
So they're retaining it for something.
Well, they're retaining it for quote-unquote training purposes and to help model how the kinds of questions you ask. They're doing it to provide a better service to you, but that's always a two-edged sword because it's also something that they now know about you, something that describes you. And I feel like we all are negotiating that. How do we feel about that? Younger people seem to have much less difficulty with it, in part because these things are not weird to them, right? They say that technology is anything that was invented after you turned 20, right? And so in some sense, those voice interfaces aren't weird to them, but I think they are also naive in thinking about where that information lives and how that information is being used. I was talking to a woman who works in AI who's also the mother of a 5-year-old. And she brought an Alexa into the house, and she realized that the 5-year-old would scream, "Alexa, pizza," when he wanted a pizza for dinner. So it wouldn't say please or thank you or anything like this. And she's like, I don't want my 5-year-old talking like this. I don't want my 5-year-old to have an example of that in the house that's rewarded because a pizza shows up. And so she's now thinking about, well, not just that we have this voice interface in the house, but how do we make this voice interface then obey those human rules that you'd want for good parenting? If you felt like you had a good parenting relationship with Alexa, you'd probably feel a lot more comfortable about having it in the house.
So do you think in ways that the technology is getting ahead of our ability to manage it at times?
I don't think it's getting ahead of our ability to manage it. I think it's getting ahead of our interest in managing it. That's the problem.
Oh, that's powerful.
Yeah.
So the desire to manage it is not as great as the desire to grow it.
You know, Facebook always gets caught out for leaking information this way and that way, and then they have this really complicated page of security settings, and someone will ding them and they'll simplify a few things. And it's because there's all of these settings because they're using all this information in all of these different ways, and everyone's like, whatever. It just goes into the too hard bin. And I feel as though we need to start to think about how we design all of these systems so that we never have a too hard bin moment with them, that they always meet us where we want and they can engage us in a human conversation about what we're doing with them and what the value of that is, and then also what the costs of that conversation is.
Yeah, and they can't really achieve those objectives without tracking us and understanding what we do and how we do it and when we do it. So really what scares us could be a very noble mission on their part, that in essence they're developing a product to serve us better. That's their argument.
Well, it is their argument. One of my friends, in fact, just on this trip in America, took me aside, and he's been working in this space as long as I have. He's like, Mark, look, if we keep on going this way, in another 5 years, there will essentially be 5 or 6 companies that are, because they control the voice interfaces, that are the gateways to all commerce. And then unless you're doing a deal with Amazon or with Apple or with Google or with Alibaba, whoever it is, you will not be able to sell anything because there's not going to be any way for you to get to a consumer because the consumers are all just going to be talking to devices and things will be showing up. And so you do have to wonder if you really close things down like that and you haven't asked the questions about who has access, who is it benefiting, where is it going, then you can end up in a bad place.
Last week when I was on Fox Business, Facebook got in trouble again
That's an old story.
It's an old story, right? So I emphasize again. And I had a couple of attorneys on. And we were talking about the fact that every Tuesday morning in Facebook, there's a group of people that have breakfast together and review their policies with regard to our free speech on their platform.
Yep.
And that they've created about 1,400 pages of policies that somehow got passed to the New York Times covertly. The New York Times then went through some of these 1,400 pages. They found errors like crazy, really stepping on rights. And so I asked the team of attorneys that I was with, how can a published document not be allowed to be censored, but yet Facebook, which isn't defined as published content, can be? And it really opened up an entire slippery slope of, digital content and censoring and filtering and altering that. What do you think about this? How do we solve this problem?
So the thing is, this is a human problem. This is not a computer problem, right?
It sure is.
And it really has to do with how do we want to construct our relationships with one another, with the fact that there's this mix of being in the real world and this mix of digital connection between us. And digital connection is an amplifier. So it allows us to talk to 100,000 people on the podcast, or it allows us to talk to someone on the other side of the world. Whereas face-to-face, we have, literally millions of years of both evolution and then tens of thousands of years in culture that regulate how we do this. And if it goes wrong, we end up in front of a judge. And cultures have their own sets of rules for what's allowed in public and what's allowed in private and all of this. And if we're handing all of that over to Facebook, or we're just saying, Facebook, this is your problem. And it's not even that. It's that Facebook created a space for public conversation and then decided that they were going to regulate it, rather than saying, oh my goodness, we've created the space for public conversation. It is now up to all of us as co-participants in that conversation to regulate it, which is, I think, their fundamental mistake, that they thought that they should be doing this, and there's no human way. I mean, this is why this document is 1,400 pages.
Yeah, you can't do it. And who are they to censor us, and who are these people? And it's some kind of censorship committee, if you will, in essence.
What they're trying to do is they're basically trying to deal with complaints, right? It's essentially like a complaint review process, and every time a complaint passes through, a new page ends up on this document. That's what it is.
And I'm told there's 7,000 people around the country that are monitoring this in real time, and it's fascinating how our laws aren't really defining this content in ways that it should be. And in that case, I found the conclusion was that our laws have to catch up with this, and that our rights need to be protected in a way, but yet somebody can't post something on Facebook that causes a riot and causes somebody to die with bad intent either. It's a really slippery slope. It's a very tough issue.
It's a really tough issue because, again, we're talking about how human beings are related. We're not really talking about corporations, even though Facebook is in there trying to play the cop, because in some sense, their economic well-being and the well-being of their stock price is also based on how well they can handle all of these different situations when people get together. Well, this is why we have laws. This is why we have courts. Facebook works across jurisdictions. It works across nations, and so people are constantly butting heads without any of the protective shield of all of the norms that we have when we approach in the flesh. And so in some ways, Facebook is going to a place no one's ever gone before, but I think their mistake was that they thought that somehow they could solve the problem. They can't solve this problem. This is a problem all of us have to solve, and I completely agree with you. We need to build regulations, and I think the best basis for regulation is always self-regulation.
Yep.
When that fails, then of course you turn to the law and you turn to the courts. Absolutely. But let's start with self-regulation. Let's think about, how do we want to behave? How do we want to connect? What are the spaces that we want to create? What works for us? And use those as a basis. And keeping in mind that there's a lot of diversity, and what works over here is going to be different than what works over here, but we can agree to certain things.
And communities can police within that community quite well.
Yes.
And they have their own parameters in each different community.
Yes.
Where one would allow something that another would not, for example.
Exactly.
So when we talk about television and content for a moment,
Yep.
I'm in the television business. I have a
Yep.
television show. My show hits about 91 million people
Wow.
a year. Big reach, and it's on marathons, and it repeats all the time. You know, today in the television business, and I'm involved in a number of shows as a producer too, it's a completely different world because of computers and distribution platforms. And they say in one breath today, if you have great content, you can always find a place for it because there's so many outlets. But getting eyeballs isn't easy with all of these outlets.
Yeah.
There has been a merger of technology and entertainment that is unlike anything I've seen these past few years. And let me give you an example, and then I'm going to ask you to expound on it. Netflix now has a concept that they're working called branching narrative. And branching narrative is really exciting. So I have to make a movie. I have to produce 5 different ends to that movie, or 4 different ends. And then while you're watching that movie, you can interact in real time. And I can say, I want Mark to buy a Mercedes-Benz, or I want Mark to buy a Chevrolet. And the narrative goes in the direction that we want it to. That's pretty powerful. It adds a big cost of production.
Yes.
And then, of course, we have technology. It allows people to produce things at home that they never could before. So the cost of producing content is way down.
Yep.
The amount of places to sell it and distribute it are way up.
Yep.
Types of content is through the roof.
Yep.
Where does this all go?
So, I mean, we're seeing this is the continuation of a trend that's been going on probably since around the middle 1990s, when, you know, audio and video production could be done on a normal laptop, right?
Yep.
Macintosh, but other kinds of laptops. And there was a real democratic revolution around shooting with digital video, mixing, and being able to release. But here's the thing, and you know, I should say I founded 2 graduate programs at universities, one here, so USC Cinema School, which is the best cinema school in the world. I founded their program in this. And then I went over and did this in Australia, and this is the reason that I live in Australia now. Although all of that production stuff got cheaper, it isn't any easier to write a good story.
It sure isn't.
Or, you know, to build a beautiful set, or to shoot a beautiful scene. I mean, you can do it with a cheaper camera, but you still are going to need a cinematographer who
Edit
understands
it right. You got to tell the story. It's got to be pretty, of course.
all of the music. And people, I think, you know, we see good films, we see bad films, we see mediocre films. I always think a good film is a miracle because it means everything went right.
Yeah.
Right? And it's
Not
like
easy.
It's not easy. And so I have an enormous sort of sympathy when I see a film that's basically a masterpiece but flawed. You know, some of my favorite films are flawed masterpieces because I know how hard it would be to get it perfectly right.
But they came so close.
They came, and they tried. And a lot of films, you're like, why are you even trying?
Right. At least they went for it.
They absolutely went for it. But I think there's an enormous scope. And the area where this is most visible is on YouTube, right? YouTube is, you know, we think Netflix is kind of the behemoth of entertainment, and it is in some ways. But in fact, it's
YouTube's the
YouTube.
future.
And the present. I was sitting with a 2.5-year-old the other morning as mommy was running around cleaning up the house, and the 2.5-year-old had found the unboxing channel where kids just unbox toys all day long, and he was just in heaven. And I'm like, how does this 2.5-year-old even know this YouTube exists? But 2.5-year-olds know this these days, and they know that there's this endless river of content that will just give her them one thing and after another thing after another thing. And I'm watching these videos. These videos are incredibly well produced, you know, presumably done on relatively low-end equipment, but still well shot, well edited, all of this. And so I think the revolution you're talking about is already there, and that YouTube represents what that looks like. And so there is a channel for a 2.5-year-old to watch unboxing videos, or a 30-year-old to watch cat videos, or whatever it is.
Or
and
a 90-year-old to learn about a no-salt diet.
Yes.
It's all there.
Absolutely. It's all absolutely there. And so that's what that world has become. Is that a world of monetization? In other words, is that a world of business, or is that simply a world of creatives sharing? The interesting thing is that mix is now much more rich than it was a billion seconds ago, where it was really all about professionals a billion seconds ago. Now there's this real mix between people who are incredibly well paid, people who are paid enough, people who are paid a little, and people who are doing it because they want to.
And it's also a great ground for cultivating talent and for people to go into that space. So we talked about cars and the future cars going electronic. We talked about computers and privacy. We talked about home automation. Where do you see the biggest, and this is an unfair question, but where do you see the biggest leaps the next couple of years?
So I'm pretty convinced now that there is an untapped revolution in wellness. So this past year, in 2018, I lost 40 pounds. And everyone's like, oh my God, how did you do it? I was like, diet and exercise. But here's the secret. All right, I got an app. There's an app called MyFitnessPal. Everyone's got it. It's a billion of them, and I just kept the food diary because there's millions of items in it. You can scan barcodes. It's really easy to keep the calories going in. And then I got myself a Fitbit, and I can keep the calories going out. And it's like keeping a budget. Which, and I'm willing to do that work, but actually all that should just be happening kind of behind the scenes, except maybe I should be pointing my smartphone camera at my meals occasionally so it can read how many calories I'm taking in. And then I should just be getting little sort of nudges all the time. It's like, oh, maybe you want to eat a little less today, maybe you want to run a little bit more, whatever it is. But it's just that it's a conversation. It's not this, oh my God, we're going to put you on a regime or make it feel really hard or anything like that.
So in essence, build it into the background of your life. So it's coaching you as you go.
Make it a conversation, right? And make it part of the rich conversation of all of our lives. There's a big thing at CES this year that we were seeing yesterday. There's a lot of things to help you sleep better because people aren't sleeping well anymore. And that's somewhat about busyness. And Reed Hastings has already said that his biggest competitor isn't Disney, it's sleep.
I could see that.
Right.
But, I have a problem with sleep, and I've bought a number of these apps. Calm is one. Is an example one that they're effective and they're working. So you see a big boom in wellness, which makes an awful lot of sense.
I feel like there's enough pieces that can be brought together now because the smartwatch, as it turns out, was the missing element. We had the smartphone, that's fine, but the smartwatch is the thing that's actually measuring our activity. Right. And we didn't know what smartwatches were for when they came out. They were kind of like, well, what is it? And we're now all clear. It's actually really about your wellness and your activity.
Because it can track your body functions in essence.
It tracks your body. I mean, the high-end ones can actually track your heartbeat so that if you have an arrhythmia or something like that, it'll do all of that. But it's now around taking that and then using those pieces to build, again, an AI model of you. So it's not a Facebook model, it's your model of you and your wellness. And that's always going to be, it's not trying to lock you into something. It's just trying to keep you sort of all the pieces running well enough. Because balance is flexible. Balance changes, are you traveling a lot? Are you busy? Are you getting enough sleep? It's all of those things. And I feel like a lot of that is going to happen because we don't lack willpower. We lack awareness, and we're going to build the new tools to help us with that awareness.
That's very astute. I'm that way. Make me aware of it, and I'll change my behavior.
Yeah.
But sometimes I don't fight enough to be aware. It's an excuse when you're not aware.
Yeah. Oh,
you run out of that
absolutely.
excuse when you're aware.
Absolutely. There are a lot of things that we weren't aware of that we're aware of now. Like we're aware, how much carbon produces. Right? We're aware of how much sun we're getting. There's an entire generation of Australians who all have melanomas and wrinkled skin because they didn't think about the fact that we're running around we have, really, really high UV levels in Australia. And the new generation doesn't do that. So awareness can clearly change. And I feel as though I'm the leading edge of Generation X. We're just starting to enter sort of serious middle age. There's going to come a reckoning, and we're all going to be thinking about, well, what does our next billion seconds look like? How can we be well in that?
I was reading a great article. That comment of awareness is so astute. I was reading an article that when we were young, 36% of high school students smoked cigarettes.
Oh, yeah.
Today it's about 9%.
Yep.
And that all comes back to awareness and education and knowledge.
Yeah.
So I guess through the wellness programs and systems that you're talking about, we can also introduce wellness at a young age where better habits are created, right? And they're more aware of the consequences of their behavior at a younger age.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, you can see this in the way we regard sunlight in Australia, that all school kids go out and they're wearing hats, but with a back flap so that even the neck's not getting. And they're taught from a very young age how to be in sunshine. And you can see that will carry through all their lives. And again, Australia has the lowest smoking rate in the world because we've taxed cigarettes. A pack of cigarettes is about $30 in Australia now. And the pack is covered with literal pictures of cancers.
That'll work.
So there's nothing about it that's appealing at all, and it's driven down to basically the lowest rate in the world. And will we ever be able to eliminate smoking? No. And you accept that, but you want to make it as unappealing as possible.
Yep. And just make people as aware of the consequences of it. You're a fascinating guy, Mark.
Thank you.
And when I look at all the things that you've done, I'm really good in my hospitality space. I rip it apart. I analyze it. I'm a nutcase. You're that way in the tech space. You're a pretty passionate guy. So my last question for you.
Yeah.
What are you really passionate about now? What are you waking up in the morning and what excites you? You've done so many things that have touched all of our lives. What's next for you?
So, I think if you'd asked this, I'm on this long tour in America now and gathering up all these interviews for the next billion seconds. And if you'd asked me at the beginning of this, I would have given you a different answer. And in fact, you actually got my answer when I was talking about wellness, because I'm now seeing both all of my friends getting older, but also our parents are all going into care of various types. And I'm seeing a generation who didn't think about this sort of thing, and the decisions are now being made for them because they can't, because they've kind of lost that space. And I'm actually getting quite passionate about, let's make, and I have friends in Australia who are totally behind this as well, let's make growing old as fantastic and amazing as it should be.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
I feel really passionate about this, in part because I can see myself growing older, but also because in part I can see us as this is a part of a shift that we can all make together. And if we get this right, then we've also done this right for our kids, for every generation after this.
That's powerful. So that's quality of life, length of life.
Well, I mean, I think it's around life, longevity, and liveliness, right? It's, how much do you really enjoy living?
Right. That's powerful. I love when Tony Robbins says to him, somebody says, you're boring. Life is boring. He goes, no, life isn't boring. You're boring. Right? So again, awareness, engage people more in life. So technology is not to be feared. AI is not to be feared. The fact is that do we have the right stewards leading this process for us?
You don't want people who are only in it for the money. This is the thing. And the problem is the billionaire is going to keep his eye on the billions just because he's a billionaire.
That's what he does.
Or she's a billionaire. That's how they got the billions. You want to have a whole bunch of voices. One of the things we know is diversity works really well in a boardroom, but it also works really well when you're talking to technology. So who's using it? Why are they using it? How are they using it? And these are a lot of questions we don't ask. Or how are they misusing it? What can we learn? You want to hand a technology to a kid and they're going to break it in 100 interesting ways. Learn from that. So I think there's a lot of ways that we can think about how to use technology and how to not overuse it. But it requires us to have, I guess, a bit of time, of consideration. It means we need to have enough sleep. We need to be taking care of ourselves. Because if we can't take care of ourselves, and we're talking about now parenting a new generation of machines that are learning, we're not going to have the energy left over to help them be the best they can.
Wow, powerful. So you see the future of machines more linked to our future and closer to our day-to-day lives than ever as we go forward.
If we get it right, then that's a positive relationship. If we don't get it right, then that's not a positive relationship.
Yeah. When you walk through CES and you walk around today, do you sense we're getting it right now?
So 2 years ago when I was walking around CES, I was sure we were not. I feel as though the conversation around this is now becoming a much bigger thing. There are tracks in CES about AI and the ethics of AI and all of this. So it feels like the most important thing is that we're having that conversation and that people are getting in the loop on that.
That's good to hear. So with the right stewardship, technology will always be closer to us and nothing to be feared of.
Hopefully.
It's been a pleasure having you, buddy.
It's been a pleasure, John.
What a great guest. I'd love to talk to you again sometime.
Please.
When you come back next year for CES, can we get together again?
Absolutely.
Awesome. Thank you. Mark Pesce, one of the greatest, I think, minds in the technical space, and the host of the new Next Billion Seconds podcast right here in the Podcast One Network. Mark, it was a pleasure. Have a great show.
All right. Thank you.
If you love my No Excuses podcast, hit subscribe at Apple Podcast, go to podcastone.com or the Podcast One app, and you'll get your new episodes every Tuesday morning.